Hi, Seagull class. I wanted to start a read-aloud with our class, and I wanted to record it so that you can listen to it whenever you want, but I'm going to record 30-minute sections of me reading so that you can use that as read-aloud time like we would at school. You can knit or crochet, or you can sketch if you want to, but we're going to start reading this new book that I just got. It's called Harriet the Spy. The author is Louisa Fitzhugh, and I've read this story before and I really love it, so I'm excited to share it with you. So we'll start the first session now. Harriet the Spy by Louisa Fitzhugh. Chapter 1. Harriet was trying to explain to Sport how to play town. See, first you make up the name of the town, and then you write down the names of all of the people who live in it. You can't have too many, or it gets too hard. I usually have 25. Sport was tossing a football in the air. They were in the courtyard of Harriet's house on East 87th Street in Manhattan. Then, when you know who lives there, you can make up what they do. For instance, Mr. Charles Hanley runs the filling station on the corner. Harriet spoke thoughtfully as she squatted next to the big tree, bending so low over her notebook that her long, straight hair touched the edges. "Don't you want to play football?" Sport asked. "Now, listen, Sport. You never did this and it's fun. Now, over here, next to this curve in the mountain, we'll put the filling station. So if anything happens there, you remember where it is." Sport tucked the football under his arm and walked over to her. "That's nothing but an old tree root. What do you mean, a mountain?" "That's a mountain. From now on, that's a mountain. Got it?" Harriet looked up into his face. Sport moved back a pace. "It looks like an old tree root," he muttered. Harriet pushed her hair back and looked at him seriously. "Sport, what are you going to be when you grow up?" "You know what? I'm going to be a ball player." "Well, I'm going to be a writer, and when I say that's a mountain, that's a mountain." Satisfied, she turned back to her town. Sport put the football gently on the ground and knelt beside her, looking over her shoulder at the notebook, in which she scribbled furiously. "Now, as soon as you've got all the men's names down, and their wives' names, and their children's names, then you figure out all of their professions. You've got to have a doctor, a lawyer, and an Indian chief," Sport interrupted. "No, someone who works in television." "Well, what makes you think they have a television?" "I say they do. And anyway, my father has to be in it, doesn't he?" "Well, then put mine in too. Put a writer in it." "Okay, we can make Mr. Jonathan Fishbein a writer. And let him have a son like me who cooks for him." Sport rocked back and forth on his heels, chanting in sing-song. "And let him be 11 years old like me, and let him have a mother who went away and has all the money, and let him grow up to be a ball player." "No!" Harriet said in disgust. "Then you're not making it up. Don't you understand?" Sport paused. "No," he said. "Just listen, Sport. See, now that we have all of this written down, I'll show you where the fun is." Harriet got very businesslike. She stood up and then got on her knees in the soft September mud so that she could lean over the little valley made between the two big roots of the tree. She referred to her notebook every now and then, but for the most part she stared intently at the mossy lowlands which made her town. Now, one night, late at night, Mr. Charles Hanley is in his filling station. He's just about to turn out the lights and go home because it's 9 o'clock and it's time for him to get ready for bed. But he's a grown-up. Sport looked intently at the spot occupied by the gas station. In this town, everybody goes to bed at 9:30, Harriet said definitely. Oh, Sport rocked a little on his heels. My father goes to bed at 9 in the morning. Sometimes I meet him getting up. And also, Dr. Jones is delivering a baby to Mrs. Harrison, right over here in the hospital. Here is the hospital, the Cartersville General Hospital. She pointed to the other side of town. Sport looked at the left route. What is Mr. Fishbein, the writer, doing? Harriet pointed to the center of town. He is in the town bar, which is right there. Harriet looked down at the town as though she was hypnotized. Here's what happens. Now, this night, as Mr. Hanley is just about to close up, a long, big, old black car drives up, and in it there are all of these men with guns. And they drive in real fast, and Mr. Hanley gets scared. They jump out of the car and run over and they rob Mr. Hanley, who is petrified. They steal all the money in the gas station, and then they fill up with gas for free, and then they zoom off into the night. Mr. Hanley is all bound and gagged on the floor. Sport's mouth hung open. Then what? At the same minute, Mrs. Harrison's baby is born, and Dr. Jones says, "You have a fine baby girl, Mrs. Harrison, a fine baby girl." Make it a boy. No, it's a girl. She already has a boy. What does the baby look like? She's ugly. Now, also at this very minute, on the other side of town, over here past the gas station, almost to the mountain, the robbers have stopped at a farmhouse which belongs to old Farmer Dodge. They go in and they find him eating oatmeal because he doesn't have any teeth. They throw the oatmeal on the floor and they demand some other food. He doesn't have anything but oatmeal though, so they beat him up. Then they settle down and spend the night. Now, at this very minute, the police chief of Cartersville, who is called Chief Herbert, takes a stroll down the main street. He senses that something is not right, and he wonders what it is. "Harriet, get up off of that mud!" A harsh voice rang out from the third floor of the brownstone behind them. Harriet looked up. There was a hint of anxiety in her face. Oh, golly, I'm not in the mud." The face of the nurse looking out the window was not the best-looking face in the world, but for all its frowning and sharp, dark lines, there was kindness there. "Harriet M. Welsh, you are to rise to your feet." Harriet rose without hesitation. "But listen, we'll have to play town standing up," she said plaintively. "That's the best way," came back sharply, and then the head disappeared. Sport stood up too. "Well, why don't we play football then?" "No, look, if I just sit here like this, then I won't be in the mud." So saying, she squatted on her heels next to the town. Now, he senses that there is something wrong. How can he? He hasn't seen anything. It's all on the other side of town. He just feels it. He's a very good police chief. "Well," Sport said dubiously. "So since he's the only policeman in town, he goes around and deputizes everybody. And he says to them, "Something is fishy in this here town. I feel it in my bones." And everybody follows him, and they get on their horses. "Horses!" Sport shrieked. They get in their squad car, and they drive around town until... Harriet! The back door slammed, and Ole Golly marched squarely toward them across the yard. Her long black shoes made a slap, slap noise on the brick. "Hey, where are you going?" asked Harriet, jumping up, because Ole Golly had on her outdoor things. Ole Golly just had indoor things and outdoor things. She never wore anything as recognizable as a skirt, a jacket, or a sweater. She just had yards and yards of tweed, which enveloped her like a lot of discarded blankets, which ballooned out when she walked, and which she referred to as her things. "I'm going to take you somewhere. It's time you begin to see the world. You're 11 years old, and it's time you saw something." She stood there above them, so tall that when they looked up, they saw the blue sky behind her head. Harriet felt a twinge of guilt, because she had seen a lot more than Ole Golly thought she had. But all she said was, "Oh boy," and jumped up and down. "Get your coat and hurry. We're leaving right now." Ole Golly always did everything right now. "Come on, Sport, it won't hurt you to look around too." "I have to be back at 7 to cook dinner." Sport jumped up as he said this. "We'll be back long before that. Harriet and I eat at 6. Why do you eat so late?" "He has cocktails first, and I have olives and peanuts." That's nice. Now go get your coats." Sport and Harriet ran through the back door, slamming it behind them. "What's all that noise?" spluttered the cook, who whirled around just in time to see them fly through the kitchen door and up the back stairs. Harriet's room was at the top of the house, so they had 3 flights to run up, and they were breathless by the time they got there. "Where are we going?" Sport shouted after Harriet's flying feet. "I don't know." Harriet panted as they entered her room. "But Ole Golly always has good places." Sport grabbed his coat and was out the door, and halfway down the steps, when Harriet said, Wait, I can't find my notebook." "Oh, well, what do you need that for?" Sport yelled from the steps. "I never go anywhere without it," came the muffled answer. "Oh, come on, Harriet." There were great cracking noises coming from the bedroom. "Harriet? Did you fall down?" A muffled but very relieved voice came out. "I found it. It must have slipped behind the bed." And Harriet emerged, clutching a green composition book. "You must have 100 of them now," Sport said as they went down the steps. "No, I have 14. This is number 15. How could I have 100? I've only been working since I was 8, and I'm only 11 now. I wouldn't even have this many, except at first I wrote so big that my regular route took almost the whole book." "You see the same people every day?" "Yes. This year I have the DeSanti family, Little Joe Curry, the Robinsons, Harrison Withers, and a new one, Mrs. Plummer. Mrs. Plummer is the hardest because I have to get in the dumbwaiter." "Can I go with you sometime?" No, silly. Spies don't go with friends. Anyway, we'd get caught if there were two of us. Why don't you get your own route? Sometimes I watch out my window, a window across the way. Well, what happens there? Nothing. A man comes home and pulls the shade down. Well, that's not very exciting. It sure isn't. They met Ole Golly waiting for them, tapping her foot outside the front door. They walked to 86th Street and took the crosstown bus, and soon they were whizzing along the subway, sitting in a line. Ole Golly, then Harriet, and then Sport. Ole Golly stared straight ahead. Harriet was scribbling furiously in her notebook. "What are you writing?" Sport asked. "I'm taking notes on all of those people who are sitting over there." "Why?" "Sport." Harriet was exasperated. "Because I've seen them, and I want to remember them." She turned back to her book and continued her notes. It has her notes in here, so I'm going to read those. This is part of her notes. Man with rolled white socks, fat legs. Woman with one cross eye and a long nose. Horrible looking little boy and a fat blonde mother who keeps wiping his nose off. Funny lady, looks like a teacher and is reading. I don't think I'd like to live where any of these people live, or do the things that they do. I bet that little boy is sad and cries a lot. I bet that lady with the cross eye looks in the mirror and just feels terrible. Ole Golly leaned over and spoke to them. "We're going to Far Rockaway. It's about 3 stops from here. I want you to see how this person lives, Harriet. This is my family." Harriet almost gasped. She looked up at Ole Golly in astonishment, but Ole Golly just stared out the window again. Harriet continued to write. And then this is part of what she's writing again. "This is incredible. Could Ole Golly have a family? I never thought about it. How could Ole Golly have a mother and a father? She's too old for one thing, and she's never said one word about them, and I've known her since I was born. Also, she doesn't get any letters. Think about this. This might be important." And that's the end of what she was writing. They came to their stop and Ole Golly led them off the subway. "Gee," said Sport as they came up onto the sidewalk. "We're near the ocean." And they could smell it, the salt, and even a wild, soft spray which blew gently across their faces. Then it was gone. "Yes," said Ole Golly briskly. Harriet could see a change in her. She walked faster and held her head higher. They were walking down a street that led to the water. The houses, set back from the sidewalk with a patch of green in front, were built of yellow brick interspersed with red. It wasn't very pretty, Harriet thought, but maybe they liked their houses this way, better than those plain red brick ones in New York. Ole Golly was walking faster and looking sterner. She looked as though she wished that she had not come. Abruptly, she turned in at a sidewalk leading to a house. She strolled relentlessly up the steps, never looking back, never saying a word. Sport and Harriet followed, wide-eyed, up the steps to the front door, through the front hall, and out the back door. She's lost her mind, Harriet thought. She and Sport looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Then they saw that Ole Golly was heading for a small private house, which sat in its own garden behind the apartment house. Harriet and Sport stood still, not knowing what to do. This little house was like a house in the country, the kind that Harriet saw when she went to Watermill in the summer. The unpainted front had the same soft gray of driftwood, the roof a darker gray. "Come on, chickens, let's go get us a hot cup of tea." Ole Golly, suddenly gay, waved from the funny little rotting porch. Harriet and Sport ran towards the house, but stopped cold when the front door opened with a loud swish. There, suddenly, was the largest woman Harriet had ever seen. "Why, look at here, what's comin'?" she bellowed. "Look at them little rascals!" And her great fat face crinkled into large, cheerful lumps as her mouth split to show a toothless grin. She let forth a high, burbling laugh. Sport and Harriet stood staring, their mouths open. The fat lady stood like a mountain, her hands on her hips, in a flowered cotton print dress and enormous hanging coat sweater. Probably the biggest sweater in the world, thought Harriet. Probably the biggest pair of shoes, too. And her shoes were a wonder. Long, black, bumpy things with high, laced sides up to the middle of the shin, bulging with the effort to hold in those ankles, their laces splitting them into grins against the white of the socks below. Harriet fairly itched to take notes on her. "Where'd you get these little things?" Her cheer rang out all over the neighborhood. "This the little Welsh baby? Is that her brother?" Sport giggled. "No, it's my husband," Harriet shouted. Ole Golly turned a grim face. "Don't be snarky, Harriet. And don't think you're such a wit either." The fat lady laughed, making her face fall in lumps again. She looks like dough, Harriet thought, about to be made into a big round Italian loaf. She wanted to tell Sport this, but Ole Golly was leading them in, all of them squeezing past that mountain of a stomach, because the fat lady stood, rather stupidly, in the doorway. Ole Golly marched to the tea kettle and put a fire under it, and then she turned in a businesslike way and introduced them. "Children, this is my mother, Mrs. Golly. Mother, you can close the door now, Mother. This is Harriet Welsh." "Harriet M. Welsh," Harriet corrected. "You know perfectly well you have no middle name, but if you insist, Harriet M. Welsh. And this is Sport. What's your last name, Sport?" "Rock. Simon Rock." Simon, hee hee hee. Harriet felt very ugly all of a sudden. "You are not to make fun of anyone's name." Ole Golly gloomed over Harriet, and it was one of those times when Harriet knew she meant it. "I take it back," Harriet said quickly. "That's better." Ole Golly turned away cheerfully. "Now, let's all sit down and have some tea." "Wow, ain't she a cute little thing?" Harriet could see that Mrs. Golly was still hung up on introductions. She stood like a mountain, her big ham hands dangling helplessly at her sides. Here's an illustration. So that must be Ole Golly's mother, Mrs. Golly. You can see the boots that they described, her jacket, the dress. She looks almost surprised in this illustration. "Sit down, Mother," Ole Golly said gently, and Mrs. Golly sat. Harriet and Sport looked at each other. The same thought was occurring to both of them. This fat lady wasn't very bright. Mrs. Golly sat to the left of Harriet, and she leaned over Harriet, in fact, and looked directly into her eyes. Harriet felt like something in a zoo. "Now, Harriet, look around you," Ole Golly said sternly as she poured the tea. "I've brought you here because you've never seen the inside of a house like this. Have you ever seen a house that has one bed, one table, 4 chairs, and a bathtub in the kitchen?" Harriet had to move her hair back to see around Miss Golly, who leaned toward her, motionless, still looking. The room was very strange. There was a sad little rug next to the stove. Harrison Withers has only a bed and a table, Harriet thought to herself. But since she didn't want Ole Golly to know that she had been peering through Harrison Withers' skylight, she said nothing. "I didn't think you had," said Ole Golly. "Look around and drink your tea, children. You may have more milk and sugar if I haven't put enough." "I don't drink tea," Sport said timidly. Ole Golly shot an eye at him. "What do you mean you don't drink tea?" "I mean, I never have." "You mean you've never tasted it?" "No," said Sport, and looked a little terrified. Harriet looked at Ole Golly. Ole Golly wore an arch expression which signified that she was about to quote. "There are few hours in life more agreeable than the hour dedicated to the ceremony known as afternoon tea." Ole Golly said this steadily and sedately, then leaned back in her chair with a satisfied look at Sport. Sport looked completely blank. "Henry James," said Ole Golly, 1843 to 1916, from Portrait of a Lady. "What's that?" Sport asked Harriet. "A novel, silly," said Harriet. "Oh, like my father writes," said Sport, and dismissed the whole thing. "My daughter's a smart one," mumbled Miss Golly, still looking straight at Harriet. "Behold, Harriet," Ole Golly said, "a woman who never had any interest in anyone else, nor in any book, nor in any school, nor in any way of life, but has lived her whole life in this room, eating and sleeping and waiting to die." Harriet stared at Mrs. Golly in horror. Should Ole Golly be saying these things? Wouldn't Mrs. Golly get mad? But Mrs. Golly just sat, looking contentedly at Harriet. Perhaps, thought Harriet, she forgets to turn her head away from something unless she's told. "Try it, Sport, it's good." Harriet spoke to Sport quickly in an effort to change the subject. Sport took a sip. "It's not bad," he said weakly. "Try everything, Sport, at least once." Ole Golly said this as though her mind weren't really on it. Harriet looked at her curiously. Ole Golly was acting very strangely indeed. She seemed... Was she angry? No, not angry. She seemed sad. Harriet realized with a start that it was the first time she had ever seen Ole Golly look sad. She hadn't even known that Ole Golly could be sad. Almost as though she were thinking the same thing, Ole Golly suddenly shook her head and sat straight up. "Well," she said brightly, "I think we have had enough tea and enough sights for one day. I think we better go home now." The most extraordinary thing happened next. Mrs. Golly leapt up to her fat feet and threw her teacup down on the floor. "You're always leaving! You're always leaving!" she screamed. "Now, Mother," Ole Golly said calmly. Mrs. Golly hopped around the middle of the floor like a giant doll. She made Harriet think of those balloons blown up like people that bounce on the end of a string. Sport giggled suddenly. Harriet felt like giggling, but wasn't sure she should. Miss Golly bobbled away. "Just come here to leave me again, always leaving. Thought you'd come for good this time." "Now, Mother," Ole Golly said again, but this time she got to her feet, walked to her mother, and laid a firm hand on her bouncing shoulder. "Mother," she said gently, "you know I'll be back here next week." "Oh, that's right," said Mrs. Golly. She stopped jumping immediately and gave a big smile to Harriet and Sport. "Oh boy," said Sport under his breath. Harriet sat fascinated. Then Ole Golly got them all bundled into their clothes, and they were outside on the street again, having waved to a cheerful Mrs. Golly. They walked along through the darkening day. "Boy, oh boy," was all Sport could say. Harriet couldn't wait to get back to her room to finish her notes. Ole Golly looked steadily ahead. There was no expression on her face at all. So that was chapter 1. Maybe something fun you can do is to think about what Ole Golly was feeling at the end of that chapter. It said that she had no expression on her face. So imagine why she wanted to take Harriet and Sport there in the first place. Maybe you can think of a reason. And then maybe you can think of how she's feeling leaving the house after seeing her mother. It could be fun. We haven't seen a picture of Ole Golly or of Sport. There was the illustration of Ole Golly's mother, and there was an illustration on the front cover of Harriet. So maybe you could also draw a picture of what you imagined Ole Golly looking like and what you imagined Sport looking like. But that's what I'm reading for today, and you can hear chapter 2 tomorrow. Bye!